At this very moment, as you hear these words, more than 45,000 American soldiers are positioned at bases around the Persian Gulf. The world is closer to a regional-scale conflict than at any point in the last 40 years. Aircraft carriers are sailing in waters where precision ballistic missiles can reach them in a matter of minutes. And the American government is carefully managing what the American public knows about all of this. The verified report from the International Atomic Energy Agency confirms Iran is weeks, not years, away from weapons-grade material. Iran's ballistic missile inventory exceeds 3,000 units. The Strait of Hormuz, 40 kilometers at its narrowest point, is the route for 21% of all global oil. American Navy admirals are monitoring the Persian Gulf with a level of concern that never surfaces in press briefings. This is not conspiracy theory. This is not anti-American rhetoric. This is how strategic communication systems function in times of conflict. The question we are going to answer today is not simply, is there an information blackout about the conflict with Iran? The answer to that question is yes, and the evidence is institutional, not speculative. The real question is, what specifically is this blackout concealing? And once you understand the answer, you will grasp why Washington's current posture toward Iran would not survive public scrutiny if the American public had full access to the real numbers, the real vulnerabilities, and the real timeline of what is at stake. By the end of this video, you will understand a specific calculation that Washington is not making in public, with verifiable numbers available in open sources that demonstrate why the current American posture in the Persian Gulf has a calculable expiration date. That calculation exists. It simply isn't showing up in the news. Let's talk about what's at stake. The Strait of Hormuz, a corridor just 40 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, is the transit route for 21% of all global oil. The Red Sea, where an Iran-backed militia conducted an anti-shipping campaign for more than a year, handles 12% of global trade. And Tehran's uranium enrichment program is positioned at a level that analysts calculate as weeks away from weapons-grade material. Not years, not decades. Weeks. None of these facts are classified. All of them are available in IAEA reports, U.S. congressional analyses, and publications from recognized think tanks. What is systematically absent is not the data. It is the synthesis of that data into a coherent narrative that reaches the American public in a persistent and continuous way. That is what we are going to build today. Section by section, data point by data point. Because understanding what the blackout conceals begins with understanding the mechanism of the blackout itself. Let's start with the mechanism. When media analysts and strategic communication researchers talk about information control in times of conflict, they are not describing science fiction. They are describing documented precedents that shape how Western democracies manage the flow of information during active confrontations. The Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, regulates more than 27,000 broadcasting stations across the United States. Each of those stations operates under a federal license. That license is renewable, revocable, and subject to conditions that include public interest obligations. The Emergency Alert System, EAS, is the technical mechanism by which the federal government can, under circumstances defined by law, intervene in national broadcasts with priority messages. The FCC's authority in national security contexts is codified in the Communications Act. This is not theory. This is in the statutes. But the most effective mechanism of information control in times of conflict is not in the statutes. And this is where this video starts to get uncomfortable. It operates through what strategic communication specialists call structured voluntary compliance, an environment in which broadcasters understand, without being directly told, that certain stories carry costs and others carry institutional benefits. The historical precedents are instructive. During World War II, the Office of War Information actively coordinated American media coverage with military objectives, determining what could be published about troop movements, casualties, and operations. In Vietnam, information management was more diffuse but equally real, until uncontrolled images reached the American public and created ruptures the system could not contain. During the Gulf War in 1991, the Pentagon implemented pool journalism. Credentialed journalists embedded with military units with controlled access and prior review of any operationally sensitive material. In Iraq in 2003, the embedded media program expanded that model into a combined mission war with real-time coverage. The structural inflection point is this. None of these systems required a classified order to strategically suppress inconvenient information. They required architecture, access rules, credentialing processes, institutional relationship dependencies that created incentives for editorial compliance without demanding explicit coercion. The legal distinction between classified information, legally protected, with penalties for disclosure, and strategically discouraged information, institutionally suppressed without formal legal mechanism, is the difference between a system that can be challenged in courts and a system that simply works. Invisible, because its mechanisms are structural and undocumented. Editors and newsroom directors who depend on Pentagon briefings, on access to officials, on credentialing for operational theater coverage, these professionals understand the limits of what can be published without ever reading a single classified circular. The broadcasting license, the press credential, the privileged access to government sources. Each of these elements creates a dependency that functions as diffuse editorial pressure. This is what the FCC symbolizes in this context. Not an agency that issues secret silence orders, but an institution whose existence, combined with the licensing structure and the Department of Defense credentialing system, creates an environment in which the blackout doesn't need to be ordered to be effective. The next question is, what, specifically, is this system currently concealing about the confrontation with Iran? Let us observe what the cameras are missing. Iran operates the largest ballistic missile arsenal in the Middle East. Estimates based on satellite imagery analysis, declassified intelligence reports, and Congressional Research Service documentation place the total inventory between 3,000 and 4,000 units. A range that includes short-range missiles like the Zelzal, medium-range systems like the Shahab-3, and long-range variants capable of striking all of Israeli territory and much of the American bases in the region with increasing precision. These numbers are not speculative. They appear in Defense Intelligence Agency reports, in the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London, and in analyses from the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. What is notably absent is the synthesis of these numbers into news coverage that persists beyond crisis headline cycles. Now, the most strategically significant element, the proliferation of drones as a vector of asymmetric warfare. The Shahed 136 drone, developed in Iran, documentedly transferred to Russia for use in Ukraine, and with derivatives delivered to proxies in Yemen and Iraq, represents a paradigm shift in modern asymmetric conflict. It costs approximately $20,000 per unit. It can be produced at industrial scale. It is difficult to detect in low-altitude flights with reduced radar signatures. And it can be launched in swarms that overwhelm defense systems designed to intercept individual high-speed threats. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, is not a conventional army and was not built to be one. Its doctrine was developed specifically to exploit the structural weaknesses of technologically superior military forces. This means avoiding conventional battles where American superiority and firepower would be decisive. It means projecting force through proxies that allow for direct attribution denial. It means using time as a weapon, wearing down interception capabilities through sustained and prolonged engagement rather than a single decisive confrontation. The axis of resistance, composed of Houthis in Yemen, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Popular Mobilization Forces in Iraq, and Syrian militias, is not a loose collection of groups with independent agendas. It is a network with communications, logistics, and operational planning, with central coordination in Tehran. The evidence for this is not theoretical. It is the pattern of coordination across multiple fronts observed after October 2023, and the documented transfer of missile and drone technology from the Iranian program to proxy operational capabilities. Here comes the question that defines this video. If Iran's capabilities are so documented and so extensive, why do American officials continue publicly framing the escalation risk as manageable? The answer is simpler and more disturbing than any conspiracy theory. Because publicly admitting that the risk is not manageable would require justifying a policy posture that the American public with full access to the data, would likely not approve. And the data that demonstrates this begins in the most active operational theater of the conflict. The shift in focus to the Red Sea reveals a similar dynamic. In October 2023, the Houthis, formerly Ansar Allah, a Yemeni militia equipped and sustained by Iran, launched an anti-shipping campaign that remains ongoing. The stated justification was solidarity with Gaza. The operational capability demonstrated was a strategic surprise for many Western analysts who had underestimated the range and precision of the arsenal transferred by Iran. Starting in November 2023, the Houthis launched hundreds of drone and missile attacks against commercial vessels and military ships in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. In response, the United States and the United Kingdom formed Operation Prosperity Guardian, a naval coalition to protect freedom of navigation in those waters. American destroyers equipped with Aegis systems were deployed specifically to intercept Houthi drones and missiles. Now comes the final piece of the puzzle. An SM-6 interceptor missile, the type primarily used by American destroyers in these interceptions, costs approximately $4 million per unit. A Shahed drone, the Houthis' primary offensive weapon, costs approximately $20,000. The offensive to defensive cost ratio is 200 to 1 in favor of the attacker. Multiply that by hundreds of engagements over more than a year. Add the operational cost of the ships, the resupply logistics, and the personnel strain of a prolonged high-intensity mission. You have a campaign where every successful interception is simultaneously a tactical victory and a strategic defeat. Because the interceptor stockpile is finite, American production capacity has real bottlenecks, and Houthi production capacity, sustained by the Iranian logistical chain, has proven remarkably resilient to American strikes on launch infrastructure in Yemen. The commercial impact was immediate and documented. Major shipping companies, Maersk, Hapag-Lloyd, MSC, rerouted vessels to the Cape of Good Hope route, adding 10 to 15 days and significant operational costs per voyage. Insurance premiums for ships that continued using the Red Sea corridor increased by multiples. Traffic volume through the Suez Canal, which under normal circumstances handles 12% of global trade, fell substantially during the peak of the campaign. This is not a crisis simulation. It is an active conflict with measurable economic impacts and real military costs, receiving a fraction of the attention its strategic weight would justify. And the question that remains open is, how long does the current interceptor stockpile sustain the engagement tempo? Iran's operational behavior suggests they have already calculated that answer. What the Red Sea demonstrated at reduced scale, the Persian Gulf scenario places at existential scale. It is essential to examine what it means to have 45,000 American soldiers within actual strike range of that arsenal, and why these numbers never surface in public debate. The United States maintains approximately 45,000 troops at bases distributed across Kuwait, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Jordan, and Iraq. These bases include Al Udeid in Qatar, the largest American air base in the Middle East, and Camp Arifjan in Kuwait, a critical logistics facility for all American operations in the region. United States Central Command, CENTCOM, oversees this entire presence from Qatar, coordinating operations across a theater stretching from the eastern Mediterranean to the Arabian Sea. Consider what it means to have 45,000 soldiers concentrated in fixed installations within strike range of more than 3,000 Iranian ballistic missiles, many with documented precision sufficient to hit specific facilities within a base, not merely the base as a broad target. We don't need to speculate about this. We have a documented case. In January 2020, following the assassination of General Qasem Soleimani, Iran launched 16 ballistic missiles against the Ain al-Assad air base in Iraq, where American forces were stationed. The attack was publicly announced by Iran hours in advance, presumably to allow evacuation of the most vulnerable personnel and to limit the pretext for American retaliation. Even so, more than 100 American service members suffered diagnosed traumatic brain injuries. The Trump administration's initial public response described the attack as resulting in no casualties. That claim was subsequently contradicted by formal military medical reports and independent journalism. What Ain al-Assad demonstrated, with deliberately limited precision, because Iran was controlling the consequences, is that Iranian ballistic missiles can penetrate American base defenses in theater. Now extrapolate to a scenario where Iran is not deliberately limiting the consequences. This is why American officials frame the risk as manageable publicly, because admitting otherwise would require justifying a posture that the public would not approve without a debate that no one in Washington wants to have. There is a question that American Navy admirals have debated internally for more than a decade, one that rarely reaches the public with the clarity it deserves. The vulnerability of aircraft carriers in confined waters. The American Navy operates aircraft carriers under a central strategic premise: power projection in open waters, with sufficient strategic depth for tactical maneuverability. The Persian Gulf is not that. The Gulf is approximately 900 kilometers long, with a maximum width of 300 kilometers. An aircraft carrier in those waters is, in terms of tactical geometry, in a confined space surrounded by missile launch platforms, drones, and potentially naval mines. The vulnerability of aircraft carriers to missile saturation tactics in confined waters is not a new concern within the American Navy. It has been an active debate for over a decade, and a documented reason why American carriers increasingly operate outside the Gulf, in the Arabian Sea, with greater strategic depth. What the Houthi campaign demonstrated, on a smaller scale, but with real data rather than simulations, is that the interception rate required to protect a high-value asset in a swarm environment is difficult to sustain with the systems currently deployed. This is the mathematical limit Washington avoids discussing in public. The SM-6s and Tomahawks are munitions manufactured within the American logistics chain. Their stockpiles are managed. Their production follows a defined pace, and their resupply in the theater of operations takes time that, in a rapid escalation scenario, may simply not be available. Iranian operational behavior, sustained logistical support to the Houthis over more than a year of high-intensity campaign, is consistent with a deliberate attrition strategy, forcing the opponent to spend high-cost munitions in response to low-cost threats until the sustainability equation becomes unbearable. If this reading of Iranian behavior is correct, and independent military analysts are beginning to articulate it explicitly, then the central question about this conflict is not, will Iran escalate, but rather, is Iran already executing its escalation strategy, and are we interpreting this as something we can manage indefinitely? If this attrition strategy is already underway, the next point of uncertainty falls on global markets. What happens the moment that calculus becomes public? The numbers arrive before any missile needs to be fired. Imagine a corridor 40 kilometers wide. Along its margins, missile batteries and documented naval mining capabilities. Through its center, 21% of all the oil that drives the global economy transits, every day, without pause, without a viable alternative. Now imagine that someone controls the lock on that corridor, and that someone is in active conflict with the United States. The Strait of Hormuz is the only exit corridor for oil from the Persian Gulf. Under normal circumstances, it processes approximately 21% of all global oil. Exports from Iran, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, and Iraq. The narrowest point of the corridor is 40 kilometers wide. A significant portion of those waters falls under Iranian territorial jurisdiction. Iran has documented naval mining capabilities in this region. During the tanker war in the 1980s, Iran effectively used mines to create real operational risk for commercial shipping in the Gulf, a capability that was not dismantled in the decades that followed, but expanded and modernized. A 48-hour disruption to transit through the Strait of Hormuz would generate disturbances in oil markets of a magnitude that months of media coverage could not contextualize or offset. Price analysis models position a sustained partial closure of the strait as capable of generating shocks that would overwhelm American strategic reserves within weeks. The impact on the American consumer would be direct and immediate. Fuel prices, transportation costs embedded in virtually every consumer good, and inflationary pressure at a political moment already sensitive to that kind of shock. But the deeper mechanism is the connection between Gulf energy and the reserve status of the dollar. The petrodollar system, the arrangement by which oil on the global market is priced and transacted primarily in dollars, is one of the structural pillars of American financial hegemony. Any severe disruption to Gulf oil supply that forces importing countries to transact outside the dollar-denominated system creates pressure on that structure. And here is the data point that rarely appears in conflict analyses, with the emphasis it deserves. Despite all American sanctions, Iran continues exporting oil, primarily to China, its primary customer. China buys that oil at substantial discounts and processes payments through mechanisms that bypass the American financial system. The sanctions that were supposed to economically isolate Iran are, in practice, accelerating the development of transaction infrastructure outside the dollar, working in the opposite direction from their stated objective. This is why economic exposure creates its own independent political incentive to minimize the severity of the conflict, separate from and reinforcing the FCC dimension. The result is coverage that systematically underweights economic exposure, not by decree, but by diffuse political calculation. And all of this rests on the premise that there is no additional variable capable of rendering every other analysis incomplete. But one exists. Imagine an engineer standing before a panel of centrifuges in some underground facility in Iran. He is not building a weapon. He is simply continuing yesterday's work. And with every hour that passes, that country moves a few more grams closer to a threshold that, once crossed, cannot be uncrossed. But there is one central element that transforms every vulnerability discussed in this video into something of a categorically different order. Iran's nuclear enrichment program has reached, according to data verified by the International Atomic Energy Agency in early 2025, a purity level of 60% uranium-235. Let that number be specific for a moment. Uranium enriched for civilian nuclear energy generation requires 3 to 5% purity. Weapons-grade material requires 90% purity or more. 60% purity positions Iran at a point on the technical curve where the difference between the current state and weapons-grade material is a matter of weeks of centrifuge operation, not significant additional technical development. The relevant technical concept is breakout, the period of time required for a country with advanced enrichment capability to produce sufficient material for a weapon, once it makes the political decision to do so. Independent analysts working exclusively with public data, IAEA reports, documented inspections, declared centrifuge capacity, calculate Iran's current breakout timeline in weeks, not years, not months, weeks. That timeline is calculable through open-source analysis. It simply is not being calculated in public forums where it would demand a specific, documented policy response. IAEA access to the Iranian nuclear program has been progressively restricted since the collapse of the JCPOA. The number of inspectors in the field, the frequency of inspections, and access to specific facilities have all been reduced. What the growing opacity in monitoring is consistent with, not proof of, but consistent with, is the doctrine of nuclear ambiguity, neither confirming nor denying capability, keeping the adversary uncertain about the real threshold, preserving political freedom of action. The most instructive historical parallel is North Korea. Pyongyang developed real nuclear capability under exactly this model. Cycles of diplomacy that created space for technical development, sustained opacity about the actual program, and the moment the program became undeniable was also the moment the options to stop it became militarily prohibitive. The window for intervention that could have prevented the capability closed while diplomacy pretended it remained open. The parallel with the current situation leaves an enormous void. If the chance to prevent Iranian nuclear capability has already closed under the same diplomatic illusion, that is the reality no American official will admit in public. It is also the subject of the next analysis on this channel. Israel watches this process from a different perspective than the American one. Israeli red lines, the threshold beyond which unilateral military action becomes state policy, are closer to the current status of the Iranian program than American public rhetoric suggests. An Israeli preemptive strike on Iranian nuclear infrastructure is a scenario CENTCOM is modeling as a concrete possibility, not as a remote classroom hypothesis. And if that strike occurs, alliance obligations and the reality of American force positioning in the region will determine American involvement regardless of declared policy intent. That scenario is not being discussed publicly with the frequency or specificity that its level of risk would warrant. The reason connects all the threads we have analyzed so far. There is a central pattern that reframes the reading of every headline about Iran going forward. When you see this complete picture, Washington's omission becomes impossible to ignore. The convergence of all these factors reveals the true suppression mechanism. What we analyzed, Iranian military capabilities systematically underrepresented, an active attrition campaign in the Red Sea, American military exposure with publicly unanswered interceptor sustainability questions, economic vulnerability connecting Gulf energy to dollar hegemony, sanctions that inadvertently accelerate transaction infrastructure outside the dollar, and a nuclear timeline that independent analysts place in weeks, is not classified information. It is open-source analysis that simply is not being synthesized in a systematic and persistent way in mainstream coverage. Why? 6 corporations control the majority of America's news infrastructure: broadcast networks, digital platforms, cable news services. These corporations have institutional relationships with the Department of Defense that include privileged access to briefings, credentialing programs, and the logistical infrastructure of conflict coverage. These relationships create editorial incentives that need not be explicit to be effective. The Pentagon actively manages media access in theaters of operation through embedding and credentialing programs. The National Security Council maintains a strategic communications doctrine with domestic application. Social media platforms have coordinated with national security agencies on content matters related to conflicts, a documented practice that became public through litigation and document discovery. Satellite images do not lie. IAEA data does not lie. Congressional Research Service reports do not lie. What the system produces is the absence of synthesis, not the elimination of individual data points, but the suppression of the complete mosaic those data points form when brought together. And here is the most disturbing and most accurate conclusion this video can offer. The blackout requires no villain. It requires no secret order, no centralized conspiracy, no single actor making coordinated suppression decisions. It only requires that each actor within the system behave according to their own institutional incentives. The silence is bipartisan because the problem is bipartisan. Republicans who build identity around military strength don't want public analysis of interceptor sustainability. Democrats who build identity around diplomatic engagement don't want public analysis of the nuclear timeline. The result, strategically incomplete information reaching the American public about a conflict with consequences potentially capable of triggering direct war, emerges without anyone needing to order it to emerge. That is precisely what makes it durable. And it is precisely what justifies the independent analysis that gathers this data and presents it without institutional filtering. So what happens next? Conflict analysts working with unclassified data identify 3 plausible escalation scenarios, not abstract hypotheticals, but trajectories modeled from documented behavior and ongoing dynamics. The first is the managed attrition status quo. The Houthis continue the campaign. The United States continues intercepting, spending interceptors, and maintaining naval presence in the Red Sea. The economic cost of the disruption persists but remains below the threshold that would force a policy change. This scenario has a natural limit that is not public. It requires the American interceptor stockpile to sustain the engagement tempo indefinitely, and the data on that sustainability is not available for public analysis. The second scenario is escalation through miscalculation. A Houthi incident that kills American sailors in politically unsustainable numbers. An interception that fails and results in damage to a high-profile asset. A proxy operation that crosses an undeclared but real threshold in Washington's perception. These incidents are not rare in managed conflict contexts. They are a statistical feature of prolonged high-intensity engagement. Each month of sustained campaign increases the probability of at least one such event. And then there is the third scenario. This is the one CENTCOM is modeling as an imminent operational risk, not a mere theoretical exercise. Unilateral Israeli action against Iranian nuclear infrastructure. A preemptive strike on Iranian territory that generates Iranian retaliation against American assets in the region, because any Israeli operation on Iranian soil will be, in Tehran's strategic perception, an operation enabled by American intelligence and operational support, regardless of what Washington publicly declares. Alliance obligations and the reality of force positioning then determine American involvement independently of declared policy intent. 45,000 American troops within range of Iranian reprisal is not a position of choice in the face of an Israeli preemptive strike. It is a fait accompli. And that fait accompli is not being publicly calculated with the frequency that its degree of probability would warrant. The public that understands these three scenarios, that understands the architecture of silence surrounding them, the actual data underpinning them, and the institutional incentives keeping them out of public debate, is better positioned to evaluate what is being decided in its name. Not as an exercise in alarm, but as an exercise in informed citizenship about decisions that directly affect energy, security, and economic stability. That is the kind of analysis the upcoming videos will continue building. Subscribe now and enable notifications, because the threads left open today have calculable answers. The interceptor inventory has a real number. The nuclear timeline has a verifiable date. Energy markets are already pricing in a risk premium that mainstream coverage has yet to publicly name, and the dollar alternative transaction infrastructure that sanctions are inadvertently accelerating is changing the global financial geometry in slow motion. None of these threads are resolved, and the pace of events is running ahead of the pace of coverage, which means every week without this analysis is a week with less framework for understanding what is being decided in your name.